Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our MDICx webinar, Clinical Trial Quality by Design, Factors Critical to Quality. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I am the Program Manager for our Clinical Trial Innovation and Reform efforts here at MDIC. For those of you who may not be familiar with MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium is a nonprofit public-private partnership dedicating to advancing the regulatory science of medical devices. We look to create tools and methods to help make clinical trials more efficient and more effective, and to ultimately get medical devices into the hands of the patients who need them. My pleasure today to introduce our two speakers. We'll have both Ann and Susan will give presentations, and then we're hoping to reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. You can enter your questions into the Q&A chat box that should be on the bottom of your screen. And with that, I will turn things over to Ann Meeker-O'Connell from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. She's going to tell us a little bit about CITI's work to advance quality by design. Ann?
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie, and to MDIC for inviting me to be here today, and good afternoon or evening or morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. I've been involved in the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative Quality by Design project for since its inception back in 2011 when I was still at FDA. And over 5 years later, I remain very passionate about the approach and its benefits. In fact, when I left FDA to come to Johnson & Johnson, one of the factors in my decision was still being able to be actively engaged in the work to see the projects through. So I'm really excited to share our journey and the project resources with you. So Stephanie, I'm having a little bit of a challenge in getting the slide to advance.
Do you want me to just advance the slides?
That would be perfect.
Okay. Yeah, we thought we had it. We thought we had it.
Just doesn't want me to have control. So if you can go to the next slide. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, this is another public-private partnership co-founded by FDA in 2007 with the goal of identifying and implementing practices that would increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. So CTTI draws on the expertise of more than 80 members across a diverse array of stakeholders, industry sponsors, investigators, patient advocacy groups, academics, trade organizations, IRBs, and government and regulatory agencies. And it brings these stakeholders together to collaborate towards solutions. So if you go to the next slide, the Quality by Design, or QBD, as you'll hear me refer to it, project is part of CTTI's portfolio related to trial quality. So before there was the QBD project, there was an initial project focused on effective and efficient monitoring as an element of quality assurance in clinical trial conduct. But there was a general recognition that fully addressing the challenges that we face in clinical trials, their complexity, their feasibility, delays from avoidable amendments, all of this required more than just streamlining one aspect of trial oversight. And we also knew that from work published by FDA that despite monitoring, there were still a small percentage of NDAs that got complete responses simply due to missing critical data. And we knew that this work also highlighted that IND studies failed to recruit a patient population appropriate to the product's intended use. And there's a lot of other kind of work, for example, from Tufts, showing that there's opportunities for streamlining, that about a quarter of study procedures in phase 3 trials aren't relevant to the assessment of its primary endpoints. And I've attended prior MDIC meetings. I know you have data suggesting similar challenges. For example, many data points collected for device trials that aren't ultimately used to support regulatory filings. Next slide. So we initiated this Quality by Design project, and we started with a first expert meeting where we kind of generally came to the conclusion that we could, and in fact we really needed to define general principles about what really matters in clinical trials. That is, what is it we need to get right to ensure the results are reliable and that participants are protected. And so as a concept, quality by design rests upon redefining quality away from the concept that quality is the absence of any error, and to a definition that quality in clinical trials is really defined by the absence of errors that matter, those errors that truly impact the reliability of the conclusions that can be drawn from the data or that materially impact subject safety. So the quality by design process involves prospectively examining the objectives of a trial while it's still being designed and defining what aspects of the trial and what factors are critical to quality, critical to meeting those objectives, and also looking at where important errors might occur in those critical areas. So that permits prospective action, whether it's tailoring trial design or focusing oversight on the opportunity for early detection of those errors that matter to prevent the trial outcomes from being negatively impacted. And so, we think that this understanding of what data and processes underpin a successful trial is really something essential to being able to manage important and likely risks and ultimately to improve quality and outcomes for clinical trials. So next slide. So if we frame it a little bit differently, quality by design is essentially a plan, do, check, act cycle. In planning, it allows organizations to prioritize the most critical determinants of a trial's quality, to identify non-essential activities, whether in the protocol or thinking about potential trial oversight and operations, and thinking about non-essential activities that could be eliminated to streamline trial quality, to streamline trial oversight, and in that planning to develop appropriate strategies to avoid, mitigate, monitor, and address important errors. These plans or strategies for managing study risk can then be implemented with leading indicators of quality measured during the study, so that's the check aspect, and this also allows swift and focused response, that action, not just for a particular trial, but in terms of taking the learnings from that particular trial and applying it to the next trial and to future trials systematically. The next slide. So we started our journey by developing what we called the principles document with the ambition to do what we said needed to be done, to develop a document that outlines those general principles for what we really need to get right in trials. We felt this could really be an important resource to aid trial teams in identifying factors critical to meeting their trial objectives. So next slide. So the principles document really describes a series of factors that we as a project team felt were generally relevant to the reliability of conclusions drawn from data, such as facilitating the collection of essential safety or efficacy data, even if patients stop their assigned treatment, and also those factors relevant to participant or patient safety. So these factors are what you'll hear me refer to as critical to quality or CTQ factors. And the principles document recognizes that what's critical to quality for one trial may differ from the next. So it may, there's an impact of trial design. So the document includes a series of questions or potential considerations to help study teams think through the relevance of these different critical to quality factors for their specific trial. The questions in the document as a whole are ultimately designed to promote critical thinking and also cross-functional dialogue at the time of trial design about what's critical for that trial and what might be errors that matter. It's not intended to serve as a tick-the-box exercise to be a checklist that people complete in isolation. I would note that it's not even best practice if it were a checklist if you're a fan of Atul Gawande and his checklist manifesto, because it's quite long. So it's really a resource, not intended to be a substitute for experience or critical thinking. It's also not all-inclusive. So we've actively encouraged further developments of the principles document, and I'm delighted to see kind of MDIC's efforts and really focusing in and adding elements specific to devices. So if you go to the next slide, we structured the principles document by placing these critical quality factors into 6 general categories, which you see here. And so you can explore the various categories of critical quality factors by clicking on them. For example, if you click on protocol design, and you can advance the slide. So if you click on it and then go to the next slide, you'll end up being provided with the CTQs, the critical quality factors that are associated with that particular category. So if you can advance the slide one more. So you can, for example, if you select show details on any element, then you can view more information about that particular critical quality factor. So next slide. So this is just an example of what you'd see for the critical quality factor of endpoints within protocol design. So it provides a general rationale for the factor, as well as potential considerations and evaluating the relevance of the factor for your particular study. So it's really intended to inform dialogue. Next slide, please. So again, we wanted use of the principles document to really truly be a thinking exercise, not one just merely to kind of create documentation or check boxes. So I tend to kind of react to it being referred to as a checklist, but I would say when people do call it a checklist, think of it as, again, like Atul Gawande describes in his checklist manifesto, as a set of checks to make sure that things that are critical aren't overlooked, and checks that also help ensure that people talk and coordinate and accept responsibility while there's still the opportunity and the power to manage the unpredictability and nuances. Next slide. So we didn't want to just create the principles document or the concepts and just kind of file it away. We wanted to test it. We wanted to see if it worked and added value. So we held a series of workshops from 2012 to 2014 to evaluate applying this principles document in practice and to test one model for prospective quality planning. So we used these workshops to refine both the principles document and the process through applying this principles document to case studies in different therapeutic areas and across different product types. Next slide. So we used breakout sessions during our workshop to model cross-functional dialogue, including inputs from patients, from clinical investigators, health authorities, and others with a stake in trial conduct. So this broad engagement was something that the team believes can greatly improve trial quality, for example, by affirming the relevance of trial design, endpoints, and feasibility with investigators and patients. So in these workshops, we asked participants to first identify for this mock protocol synopsis what factors were critical to quality, and subsequently to identify and proactively a plan for addressing important risks for one of those CTQs. So we had a good day and a half of introductory materials and then the opportunity for people to apply what they learned. Next slide. So once we had completed a series of workshops, we took a step back to evaluate the workshop's impact. So we did this in 2014. Really, we wanted to know whether these workshops facilitated organizations and subsequently applying the quality of design principles. Next slide. So we'd heard from interviewees that the workshops overall were valuable. Participants and their organizations indicated that their organizations really believed in this approach, that strongly affirmed that it was a better way to manage clinical trials, but they found that moving from understanding the concept of QBD to truly applying it holistically in their organizations was a challenge. So the impact in their organizations varied primarily due to what we heard reported as cultural barriers, including just a general fear of change, difficulty overcoming organizational inertia, and at times concern that it would take more time or create more work. So if you go to the next slide, we reflected on this as a team and some of the, looked at the reported challenges, and we thought it would be useful to develop resources to encourage and support organizations. So the first resource we developed were formal project recommendations. So these are on the CTTI website and also included in a publication we had this spring in the Clinical Trials Journal. So I'll briefly walk through the recommendations, which are on the next slide. So the first recommendation, if we can advance the slide, is really, oh, sorry, one back, it really focuses on that culture, to create a culture that values and rewards critical thinking and open dialogue about quality. So this it really gets back to the kind of cross-functional dialogue. We wanted to encourage this proactive dialogue about what's critical to quality for a particular trial or development program, and discourage people from over-reliance on checklists or inflexible one-size-fits-all approaches that could potentially be counter to creation of specific strategies and actions for a given study. We also wanted people to sense check that their quality or performance measures were aligned with the incentives in driving a culture that awards critical thinking. So you could think, for example, that if you're in an organization where study teams who are shortening the time to first patient enrolled, that may actually serve as a disincentive to devoting time to this prospective quality planning. So our second recommendation centered on focusing on activities that are essential to the credibility of study outcomes. So we wanted to encourage teams to really rigorously evaluate study design to verify that the planned activities, the data collection were truly essential, and take steps to streamline trial design where feasible. And a lot of this, some of it's trial design, but some of it's looking at non-essential activities that may be eliminated. If you're focusing on critical data, you may be able to streamline some of the study oversight as well. So we really felt this would be a way to simplify conduct and improve trial efficiency, and also be able to target resources to critical areas. The third recommendation, again, links to this concept of involving the broad range of stakeholders in protocol development and discussions around quality. The team felt that the process of building quality into a study could be informed not only by individuals across functions within a sponsor organization, but also by including participations of those who are directly involved in the study being completed successfully, such as the investigators, study coordinators, and patients. And one of the other kind of considerations we had is if you have a study that involves novel features and elements that are considered critical to quality, for example, defining patient populations, procedures, or endpoints, the team felt that early engagement with regulators should also be considered. So the last recommendation relates to the Quality by Design Principles document, and prospectively using it as a resource to prospectively identify and also periodically review the critical to quality factors. So we've talked a lot about this is beneficial to planning. For example, if you have a cardiovascular major morbidity outcomes trial, strategies to ensure the survival status of all participants is captured would be critical. But making sure that patients' temperature readings were obtained as a part of vital signs assessment, routine study visits would unlikely be critical. So there's that planning piece, but because we know that new or unanticipated issues could arise once a study is begun, we also wanted to remind people that it's important to step back and periodically review critical quality factors to determine whether new things that weren't anticipated initially have arisen, or whether there are any adjustments to study oversight that might be needed. Next slide. So our last resource, and one that I'm really proud of that we have, is a toolkit. So this is an online toolkit, and you go to the next slide, you can see a screenshot of it. So this toolkit includes resources for researchers first learning about QBD concepts, as well as those who are ready to fully implement quality by design in a clinical trial. So the toolkit includes an introduction to QBD concepts. It includes tools if you're in a position where you want to teach others in your organization about quality by design and its use. And it also includes tools for operationalizing quality by design in your next clinical trial, and includes the interactive quality by design principles document that I referenced earlier. So we felt that these two resources, the toolkit and kind of recommendations in a publication, may be beneficial to help organizations further kind of socialize and implement quality by design in their organizations. So I think that's my last slide. I hope you've enjoyed the story of our journey and welcome your questions at the end.
Great, thank you, Anne. As Anne mentioned, MDIC, after having seen this terrific toolkit that CITI put together on quality by design, we decided to think about some of the considerations that are important specifically for medical device clinical trials. And it's my pleasure to introduce Suzanne Albert, who is the chair of MDIC's Clinical Trial Design Working Group. And she's going to tell us a little bit about the work that MDIC has done to offer an additional resource to work side by side with this terrific work that CITI has done.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'll add my welcome to Stephanie's and Anne's. I think it's really important to think about this sort of as tiered approach going through. As you've heard, CTTI, CITI's done a lot of work on looking at the way trials are conducted and quality going into the trials. And one of the things that our working group on clinical trials in MDIC was looking at is what are some of the unique challenges and the unique problems that are faced by those designing trials for medical devices. And in order to do that, we kind of thought, okay, so what are the differences? What's going on here? So one issue is that the diversity of medical technology and the myriad of places where technology is now being used in healthcare and in different types of patients, different stages of patients, different places where patients are, adds to the complexity of dealing with the design of really not just quality trials, but efficient quality trials, with an approach not to add, as Anne pointed out already, it's not about adding a lot of things, it's about making sure that the work that's being done is geared both to the quality of the trial and the data you want to get, as well as making it as efficient as possible. So we looked at those issues. We recognize that on the medical device side, there are many ancillary things that come into our trials. If you're looking at, for example, trials for implanting medical devices, or for monitoring certain types of disease, or for diagnosing, the way of understanding who are the real target patients sometimes requires other devices. So looking at how do we make sure that as we do this, as we screen, as we select, as we sort patients, we're doing that properly, and thinking about all of the evaluations. Unfortunately, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, medical device trials tend to add a lot of procedures as well as visits to the standard of care of patients. And we were looking at one of the issues is how do we make sure that we're only doing the things that are needed to be done. So that was another one of the aspects. And also, how do we make the trials as efficient both for the facilities where trials are being conducted as well as for the patients? And by that I really mean, how do we fit all of the things that need to be done for patients, from screening through enrollment, through a procedure if that's necessary, through monitoring over long term? How do we make sure that we are cognizant of what's happening to patients and their caregivers, and do that in an efficient way. And one of the things we recognized, go to the next slide, is that we tend to collect a lot of data. We tend to do a lot and collect a lot. And this is sort of a spoiler slide because it talks to the things I'm going to talk to about some work that we did. And that is, and Anne mentioned it as well, and that is we tend to collect a lot of data. We collect a lot of tests. We collect a lot of information. We've got exceedingly long and complicated case report forms. And we really didn't know when we started our projects how much of this data was actually critical. So before we started to work on the quality by design process, we did a survey across the MDIC membership to look at what does the real world in medical device clinical trials look like. We know that there have been a number of studies that have been done on clinical trials. Many of them, however, are in the pharmaceutical arena, and we wanted to make sure that the data that was being reflected in the publications was pertinent as well to medical device studies, and determine whether there were things that were happening today, current, in the medical device industry in the conduct of trials that we needed to be aware of as we proceeded to look at how we make trials more efficient, more cost-effective, and assure that they remain pertinent to regulators, to payers, to patients, and to caregivers. So we did a survey, and we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what we learned in that survey. And here's just some of the data. I want to remind you that as a public-private partnership, all of our work products are available online on the MDIC website. So you can look at the report on the study itself in more detail, as well as all of the work of all the working groups. Today we're talking just about the clinical trials, but all of the MDIC work is available on the website to anybody. You don't have to be an MDIC member to get access to us. So we did this survey, and as you can see, what we found out is that we're collecting a lot of data, that we are collecting a lot of data that goes way beyond what's in standard of care, that we're asking patients, as I already said, to come back a lot more than they normally would. And as it's extremely important to the organizations that are designing and conducting trials, the issue is, are we being cost conscious? Are we thinking about what the costs are going to be for running trials in certain ways, bringing other people into the analyses, like central labs and all the oversight committees, and making sure that we're using them where we need them, making sure we use them when we need them, let me put the emphasis on that, but not using them as a knee-jerk in situations where they're not needed, because frankly they are a bit expensive. And just making people aware that these are important choices that affect the quality of trials as well as the efficiency of trials. So as you can see on this slide, the result of our evaluation is that today we're collecting more than we need, at least more than we need for regulatory purposes. We also found in our survey that many of the things that were being collected for a lot of other reasons. And the messaging there is, if it's needed for regulatory, if it's needed for payment, or if it's needed for other purposes, think about the timing of collecting that data. Think about the efficiency. Is this one or two trials? Burdening a single trial with everything that you ever wanted to know about your product may not be the most cost-effective or efficient way to collect data on medical devices. So there's a lot of detail here, but the bottom line message is we don't use a lot of our data. We collect it, but we don't use it, at least not for regulatory, and maybe not in the first in the first year or so of the use of the product. So that's a message that came clearly out of the studies. And even when we looked at other things like publications and sales and marketing, not all the data was used. So data collection is a big issue for efficiency as well as cost. And another set of issues, and I take this as a set, that came out of that work has to do with the way in which we look at how we evaluate and work with sites. And this was reinforced when we took our data from our study and looking at all of the data we're collecting, all of the visits we're having, and tried to understand how we can help clarify from the perspective of trial conduct better ways to do this. The CTTI document is a wonderful way of looking at that information and then adding some of the learning from the survey that we did in the medical device industry. So we drilled down at least one level, sometimes two, to address some of these. And one of the reasons that we drilled down even a little bit more and we're very explicit on some of the issues in device trials will not come as a surprise to anybody on this call, and that is that there are a lot of medical device companies, and some of them have never done trials before, that many companies only do one trial. They have one product, they may only do one trial. So they haven't got all of the learning and all of the history that larger companies or older companies have. And we wanted to be sure that the documents, this pair of documents, was accessible and useful for all of the companies that are doing trials. And so we were very explicit about some detail, the tools, and then some of the things about their application. So if you look at this slide on site and training, when we look at the way in which we select our sites for clinical trials, the issues aren't just about whether or not they have the patients. That's clearly one big issue, and that's highlighted in the CTTI document. But in medical devices, sometimes you have to look at all of the other expertise that needs to surround the conduct of a medical device trial. And that can include specific kinds of imaging, specific access to diagnostic testing, having teams that are expert in other procedures being available at the time that a medical device is being implanted. All of these things, plus the fact that our follow-up times in many trials tend to be quite long, and it means that the patient may not be being seen in the same location by the same team. And so looking at sites and site training, we highlighted some of the very specific things that the medical device companies who've been doing this a long time found were issues that were complications of their trials, delayed the start of their trials, or caused them to take hiatus in their trials. So the site was really, really important. Another thing that turned up as being extremely important is that in many cases we are putting into clinical trials a technology or an intervention either in a patient population or at a time that nothing has ever been used before. So we have a unique technology, and it's going into patient flow in a place where there has not been an intervention before. So really training sites and the investigators not only on what the technology is and how it's used, but really making sure that there's a clear understanding of when it's going to be used, what else needs to be done to patients, how patients need to be aware, how patients need to be trained, introducing new types of risks. And so all of those things also went into the detail that we added in our companion document to the CTTI document, because, again, we wanted it to be even more detailed and hands-on for making it as useful as possible. And then another area that you'll see expanded in our document is looking at all of the all of the accessory organizations that we tend to use in medical device trials, and just calling them out and highlighting them as tools that can be used, can be very useful, but also places where, in order to have a quality clinical trial, certain aspects of those trials need to make sure they're built in early when you're dealing with core laboratories. When you need to maintain the masking of the assignment of a patient throughout all of the handling of all of their trial information that gets sent to core laboratories, that is shipped and brought back, especially in these days of electronic health records where many trials are working through electronic health records. Maintaining anonymity and masking and all of that, those are special challenges, and we wanted to make sure that we called out those special challenges so that the quality of the trial and the efficiency of the trial would not be affected by delay. And then, as I mentioned, all of the players really need to understand the technology and how these things work, which means that there's upfront time investment. And we highlighted that ownership and control and communication with all of these different organizations is a critical factor in designing medical device clinical trials that have high quality. These are places where our membership in the committee that helped put together these comments identified that there have been problems. There have been real issues and delays, and sometimes things that come up at the ends of trials. And so really making sure that everyone who's going to touch the trial is fully aware of those issues was extremely important to us. And then the patients and caregivers. And we wanted to make special note that in medical device trials, and it's true, I'm sure, in pharma trials as well, having done some of those in my career as well, that it's about the patient, it's about the patient understanding, but it's also about caregivers. In many cases, particularly on the device side, patients cannot do all of their care by themselves. And there are caregivers, family members, other people in the lives of patients who are also engaged in the trial and sometimes are actually conducting some of the interventions at home, because many of our devices today are used in that home environment. And so if you are not one of those companies and wondering why we paid so much attention to those things, it's because if we look broadly across all of the types of medical devices and all the places that medical devices can be used, a lot of them now are being used outside of healthcare facilities. And in those situations, there are many people who are not healthcare providers, who are not highly trained in healthcare, who are managing patients and devices. And we wanted to make sure that we called that out as an issue, because it clearly has an impact on the quality of the data that will be captured. So we really wanted to add those issues to the CTTI document as added detail, added tools. We referred there's lots of references in our document to other places to look and other places to go, as there are in the city document. And my advice to everyone on the phone is take a good look and utilize all of the resources in both documents. Read them both. They are intended to be used together, not separately. They're intended to be used together in the medical device space. And use all the resources, and use the resources of your friends and acquaintances who work in companies who may have done more trials than you. We are a collaborative group of people who work on this side of the arena. We share a lot of information and a lot of tools. And as you can see in the slide that's up now, there are MDIC resources as well as CTTI resources. So with that, I'm going to stop and leave it, turn it back to Stephanie for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Susan. So as we mentioned before, we would love to answer some questions, and there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen that where you can enter questions. But I will pose a first question to Ann and Susan, and to just tell us a little bit kind of about what's next then for these two initiatives. Ann, perhaps you can start us off?
Yeah, sure. I think for the Quality by Design initiative, I think the team's work is essentially largely done at this point. I think what we are encouraging people to use the resources, use the tools, and certainly if people have feedback or questions or additions to reach out. But I think one of the things that we really would like to see is kind of experiences from those who have embraced the approach. We did a series of webinars to give some more tangible examples of how people had applied or were starting to apply quality by design, but I think the team would love to see more of those.
Terrific.
And so this is Susan. Two things. One is that one of the things that we're doing in MDIC is we put out the documents, and they're available to everyone, and we welcome comments, criticisms, additions, deletions. These are living documents for us, as well as the fact that there's an annual meeting coming up in September, on September 21st in DC. And at that meeting, these initiatives will be spoken about, and there'll be a chance to interact with the contributors, some of the contributors to these, as well as other individuals, to talk about the detail. And as I said, we're a collaborative lot. So it's a nice way of being able to talk to people who are working in this area, and we're looking at regulatory science as a tool to improve and enhance the work within each of the companies. Stephanie, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I will just add that I appreciate Susan making the first plug for MDIC's annual public forum, and certainly through that forum and through events like this, we seek to kind of build on collaborations that we have within our group and welcome suggestions for additional tools and areas where we can help address some of the issues, because I think many of the issues are known. Like we understand, and when we did that survey of our member companies and their medical device trials, everyone's like, oh yeah, we know we collect way more data than we use. I mean, and forcing that, to kind of get a snapshot of that and say, okay, well, now we know what the problem is. What are some additional things that MDIC can work on to improve that process? So we've had a question come in, and I'll pose this to both of you. Logistically, on a day-to-day basis, can you give an example of how this approach has been implemented successfully? And Ann, maybe we'll start with you. I don't know if you have any examples of that you can share of folks that have implemented quality by design in their trials.
Sure. I think kind of, and I can speak to kind of what we have done or has been done at Janssen, where the concepts, the elements of the principles document are incorporated into a process during the kind of initial trials development and planning. So there are cross-functional meetings. I think we're working to optimize the process. There have been some lessons learned in terms of finding that these discussions really work best when they occur prior to when a trial protocol has been finalized, and there are still opportunities where you see potential ways to eliminate or avoid an error that matters through trial design. There are still opportunities to address that, and also streamlining the kind of meeting structure. But that process basically allows people to look at the trial, identify what's critical, identify specific risks, and then capture, kind of transition some of the activities to the specific functions. So if it's related to oversight, things that might go into a risk-based monitoring plan, actions that might feed into a statistical analysis plan. So it took time to develop, but I think that it's something that it can be meaningfully implemented and operationalized.
Yeah, and I would add to that two items, two places to look. One is, this has been my experience when I sat in a couple of companies, and that is, based on this information and these tools, take another look at your SOPs, at your clinical trials SOPs, and see if they are sensitive to these issues. You might be wanting to update your SOPs to add some of these considerations into them, as well as doing something internally in the company with all of the other people who work on trials, because it's not the clinical trials group and just the regulatory folks, but your marketing people, your device design teams, helping everyone understand where these issues come up for the trials you're doing, because they impact broadly. And I know Ann spoke to that about having all of the people who are impacted and impacting your trial be included. This is an opportunity, having this kind of documentation that's not coming from you. It's coming from outside. It's coming from a broader context, as something that you can use internally is something that I would suggest.
Yeah, I would say kind of in addition to that, that was a great point about looking at your SOPs and maybe also looking at, for those organizations that have a project management or strategic planning that map kind of critical, here are the critical milestones in our trial design and development, getting that kind of that dialogue inserted into the timeline so you can make sure that it occurs has also been a benefit.
Right, and one thing I didn't mention earlier, and that is MDIC is also looking at risk-based monitoring in the device space, again, because there are some unique challenges. So you can look forward to that as well from the different groups that are working on clinical trial efficiency in MDIC.
And on that resources page that we showed earlier, that's where kind of all of the stuff will kind of populate as it is completed. But certainly that risk-based monitoring is one of our next big initiatives, and then also looking at this idea of leaning out data sets, getting back to that idea of the massive amounts of data that are collected. And we have a couple of case studies from some of our members that have deliberately tried to, okay, how can we lean these out a little bit? And so we're looking forward to sharing those results in the coming months as well. Another question here from our audience, and asking if you can comment on the types of expertise that are critical to the successful design, conduct, and analysis of a quality trial to evaluate safety and effectiveness of a new medical device, apart from just the regulatory requirements, but really thinking about the evaluating safety and effectiveness of a device.
Do you want to start, Ann? Do you want me to start?
Why don't you give it a start?
Okay. So clearly, as I already mentioned, it's not about the regulatory people and the clinical people alone. But the wide array of people who need to be engaged with the issues around trial and trial design and conduct. Everyone from those who supply the devices, those who receive the devices at your sites, maintaining inventories, all of those things are really important. The logistical support for a clinical trial is a really critical aspect of conducting the trial. So once you've got a really good quality design of a trial, you've identified the sites, you've trained them according to the things that we've already talked about, then there's literally the doing. And those logistics are a critical piece both in the company and at the sites. So that's another place that I would put emphasis. And we didn't mention it, but I will. Company management. Your management really needs to understand the complexity of the trials and all of the logistics so that they are realistic about what it's going to take to initiate a trial, what it takes to conduct the trial, and then the analysis, the statistical analyses, the closing out of a trial, all of those management issues that the clinical team is aware of need to be also clearly visible at the management level so that you have the resources and the time to do the trial in the way it should be done. Ann?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, in terms of some of the kind of expertise, you know, some of the concepts you were mentioning were resonating. So looking at if you have a particular, particularly, and I think in terms of the pharma world, the clinical supply chain, if you want to design a trial that has those, and I think we had this with one of our case studies, you want to have these, double dummy blinded, multiple doses, that's going to take, it's going to have this much impact on the organization, the clinical supply organization, and be so complex that it may actually be infeasible to conduct the study. So I think it's the range of different perspectives together that people bring to the table and considerations that somebody who's sitting in one functional silo may not have thought about. The one kind of expertise that I really love to highlight is that of the patients, because I think we found that during our workshops, in some of our breakout sessions, those were the individuals who were first to speak up and really bring into question some of the basic kind of premises of the study and challenge people to look at design differently. So we had an oncology synopsis or proposed trial that the patient had actually, in the breakout session, actually said, I wouldn't participate in this trial, and I wouldn't encourage my fellow patient advocates to participate because this trial is it appears to be a Me Too product that it doesn't seem that, based on the design, would present any significant advantage over other things that are available. So that was just, I think a lot of people sat there kind of a little bit shocked, but I think it was very valuable feedback. So, when I hear expertise, I think it's not just necessarily kind of the expertise in trial design or I know all the regulations, but the collective expertise of people that are involved in trial conduct and completion.
Right, and the questioner was asking, for detail in terms of the types of expertise. I think we've hit on many of them, and where they reside, whether they reside in your company, whether they reside in your CRO, or they reside at the site. It's really expertise in understanding the disease and the patient population that you're dealing with, in the sense of how are they cared for today, how is the trial going to impact that care, is it going to add different testing, different visits? Is it going to change the flow of patients at the site, whether it's an outpatient clinic or an OR? What's the current state, and what are the changes that are going to have to take place? So an expertise to really understand how this is actually going to happen for patients. That's an expertise that I think is extremely important. Another one is in clinical trials, you know, there are lots of sites that will tell you that they've done trials. Doesn't mean they've done them successfully, doesn't mean they've done them efficiently. So having someone who really has been through it, who has the experience of having done a trial, been at a site, or managed a lot of sites, that expertise is invaluable because it has to do with things like when does a patient get identified? How do they get identified? Who needs to talk to them? What does the patient need to know about their care, as well as what the caregivers need to know? So expertise in actually, how do you make this happen? How do you actually, what door does the patient walk in, and where do they need to go? Both figuratively and literally. So somebody who really has the understanding of the type of patient that you are enrolling in your trial and what this trial will mean to that patient is an extremely important expertise. An expertise in understanding how to manage data, how to control and keep data masked, and how to keep control of data. We have to deal with not only the masking in our trials, but we also have to keep track of HIPAA because we're responsible. So expertise in understanding privacy and in understanding data management is critically important. Not just the statistics that need to be done, but actually the management of the data. How is the data going to move? Where is it going to move? Who's going to have access to it? The expertise to understand if it's a randomized blinded trial, how do you actually do that? How do you maintain that? Because that's a skill set that's not in the clinical care community and isn't necessarily in the community unless you've done randomized, concurrently controlled, masked trials. So I hope that answers your question about the kinds of expertise, and it will be driven by the technology as well as the trial design. We didn't really talk about the need for expertise in the use of the technology. We kind of assume it, but frequently it means that someone from the company or from the CRO or that you hire is present at the site to assure that the technology is used properly. Some technologies need to be integrated into EMRs, some need to be integrated into other systems for monitoring, and so that's another kind of expertise. And looking at what you're doing, what the device is, what the trial is, and what the site is, with those kinds of questions in mind, and thinking about, okay, so what expertise is needed to do that, it breaks it down. So hopefully that's useful.
All right. Well, thank you again, Susan and Ann. This has been a terrific session. I appreciate the conversation we've been able to have today. So the recording from today's webinar will be available on MDIC's website. As Susan and I mentioned, we have MDIC's upcoming annual public forum that's up on the screen right now, also on our website. And then, of course, the resources from MDIC and City. We encourage you to take a look at these resources and use them. As I tell folks, these devices and to use them together. As I tell folks when I give presentations on the work MDIC has done, it does no good for us to do this work unless you all actually take these tools and use them in your clinical trials. So thank you again for joining us.